Today, what I want to talk about is personal finance for the people. There's a couple of different versions of this that I will do. This one specifically, I wanted to look at two ideas within the topic of personal finance. First one is perspective, because I think that's where we have to start within personal finance. And then the second one is the idea of inclusion. This is a topic that many of our businesses are beginning to focus on more heavily in today's world. This idea of DEI movements. And at the end of the day, what we're finding is that just like in ecological systems, where we create more resilient and stronger communities when we have diversity within them, diversity of thought, diversity of experiences. This is true also for our businesses, for our companies, for our human communities. So we'll get into that a little bit as well. Here's the agenda for today. I wanted to start off talking about some data. So why 2024 is not 1980. As we jump into things, I think you will recognize kind of that why that obvious statement is especially true when it comes to personal finances. We are just not in the same world that we were in. And I think recognizing that, because we don't often talk about the real numbers there, I think recognizing that can give us some perspective that can help move us forward in our businesses as well. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about where I think we have to start when it comes to personal finance, and that is with perspective. We all come to money from our own unique perspective, and we'll dive into that a little bit more. I think money psychology plays a huge role in us beginning to define systems that will actually work for our unique perspectives that we bring to the world of money. Then I'm going to go into a little bit of an inclusion case study. I wanted to highlight several women in the personal finance space that are bringing a perspective to the topic that is opening the doors for just so many more conversations than we have had historically in this space. Do a little bit of a discussion of where do we take it from here. And then lastly, we'll end with questions and discussion. I started to mention that there are kind of a couple of tracks to this idea of personal finance for the people. One of them is that I oftentimes will talk about it from the perspective of our businesses are beginning to recognize more and more that if we can support our employees, I like to use the term also coworkers, when it comes to personal finance, it can give us a strategic advantage within our businesses as well. And so that track is not really what I'm focused on during this particular presentation, but I will try to add in a little bit of that to the conversation, because I do know that several of my friends who are in the HR space signed up to do this webinar also. And I think some of that perspective can be helpful to just add into this topic as well. With that said, I want to jump into it. So really where I wanted to start is here. This is a little bit where we can add a little bit more of that HR perspective in here. But really it's framing where we're at in the modern world when it comes to personal finance. We have a new problem, something that we haven't necessarily seen historically. I'm going to throw these three stats at you very briefly, but then I want to talk a little bit more on the, let's say, the story side of things to expand upon these stats a little bit more, because I think there's more behind this. But in recent surveys, we have found that 75 to 81% of employees say that financial problems have affected their productivity while at work. 6% of employees strongly agree that their organization does anything to help them manage their finances more effectively. This is something where, if there is a benefit program like a retirement program, a 401k, anything like that, sometimes that it's a perception issue. And so sometimes this can be something where if we can more effectively communicate some of the benefits, we can raise that percentage. But that's all I'll say for there right now. That's where the stats stand in terms of some of these surveys. And then lastly, 60% of employees say they would be more likely to stay at a job that provided useful financial wellness programs. Again, I want to really use this to set the context of where we're at now versus where we have been historically. I will also say the story behind these stats. There are several studies out there. One of them actually came from a 2017 study, so the number has gone up since then. But in this 2017 study, they identified that in the US as a whole, on average, we are losing $250 billion of productivity a year due simply to employees being distracted by personal financial matters while on the job. In that study and in several that have been done since then, the average amount of time that employees spend distracted from their workplace tasks is around 13 to 14 hours per month. And so if you think about it, like really how this number could be calculated is we could think about it as being like, man, we're paying employees, our coworkers, for the time that they end up spending distracted by a personal financial problem. And we could calculate how much, salary was being devoted towards that. But the thing is that this is actually a two-sided coin, right? Because we're also losing out on whatever gains could have been made in terms of productivity during that amount of time, right? Maybe that person closed a few less deals. Maybe they, kind of messed up on a batch of that they were working on for production that needed to be restarted, whatever the case is. So that's really where some of these numbers are coming from. And the reason that I highlight this is because, again, I want to give us the perspective of where we're at historically when it comes to really like how as a whole we are feeling about our personal finances. And really what that means is, at the end of the day, we are in a place where goodness, we live in a capitalist society that just throws us to the wolves, financially speaking, right? Like there is no training, no education that we get in school. And so most people end up being left to figure it out on their own. And my contention and what I hope to display through a little bit of data here is that we are just in a different economic world. The margin for error in terms of making mistakes in our personal finances and then getting to a place where we figure it out and we kind of get it together for ourselves, the margin for the error there is just smaller than it has ever been. It is really challenging to make mistakes and then to not feel like we are constantly behind. So all of the stats about employee productivity, like I don't think that that's something that we should get up on our high horses and say, oh, employees shouldn't be distracted at work. It is the reality of the economic times that we live in. And the question then becomes, how can we start to support our coworkers in these regards to move us past any financial anxiety or stress towards that bigger and brighter future? And on the business end of things, towards higher productivity and employee retention times. Here's the data that I wanted to show to support some of this contention. So the top right, we have the personal savings rate. And this chart goes back to 1960 and goes all the way to, it's not 2024, it's 2023 or so on the far right of this chart. So what this is it is how much are people across the United States on average, how much of their gross income are they putting towards savings? And that could be savings or investments. And what you'll see when we start to look at this chart is that, from the 60s all the way through 1980, this number is really at 10% or above. And then we start to see a trend sometime in the range of 1985 where this number starts to decline further and further. And of course, the 2008 recession had an impact on personal savings rate. When people are in more times of kind of broader economic uncertainty, they do tend to, no matter what, even if it means restricting other portions of their lives, be able to put a higher amount towards savings. But even at that time, we see this rate hovering around 5%. It's no longer at that 10% or above mark. The pandemic, as we can see in 2020, the massive amounts of stimulus added to the economy certainly had some strange dynamics that occurred for the next couple of years. There are whole, tracks that we could analyze in terms of what went on there. I'm going to skip that for right now because the point is that right now we have seen in the last little while that we are back to that kind of pre-pandemic trend. The most recent number in regards to personal savings rate shows us at about 3.6% of our gross income is going towards savings. So much lower than we've seen historically. And of course, this begs the question that comes up a lot is, well, are more and more younger folks or are the younger generations basically creating a higher percentage of their gross pay is going towards discretionary spending? right? Are we spending on just, like the term that we hear a lot out there is, well, the reason that millennials, are struggling in their finances, or the reason that Gen Z are struggling is because of all of the lattes and avocado toast that they're taking advantage of and buying, right? And so I wanted to see, like, is that the case? And so if we go and look at the real disposable personal income, this is the second graph shown, the one on the lower right portion of the screen. If we look at the real personal disposable income over time, we see that in 1980, that number, if we adjust it for inflation, was around $18,400. In 2022, that number was 16,000-ish dollars. So the answer is no. Like we are not spending more when it comes to disposable income, to our discretionary spending. In fact, there are some other big key factors that I want to talk about next that are really causing and driving some of this economic change that we're seeing. So this data comes from a number of different sources. I have tried to pull it from not only reputable sources, but also from several different sources. And so if you actually check out this same type of data from some big leaders out there, like Kristen Meserly, she works in the housing space, or even Scott Galloway is a professor at NYU that covers finance, you'll see that their numbers are even more drastic than the ones that I've pulled here. I've tried to be very conservative. Whenever there is a range that I'll see within studies, I try to take the higher end of the range for 1980 and to take, kind of mid-range or so for 2022, just so I'm being fair and representative here. And so, yes, again, you'll see these numbers look even more drastic in other circumstances, but I think even these tell the story of how things have changed quite a bit. So what you'll see here is in 1980, notice that everything is inflation adjusted first with the star after it. I've put the unadjusted values in parentheses. If we look at the cost of tuition fees, room and board in 1980, it was somewhere around 11,000. That has more than doubled at this point. And yet the next line, you'll see that starting salaries with bachelor's degrees, inflation adjusted, they are basically the same as they were. We can also look at median family income, basically the same once we've adjusted for inflation. And it's important to keep in mind that in this regard, we have far more two-income households than we did in 1980. There were a lot more one-income households present during that time. We can also go into median home price and see that the jump was from, and again, this is where I was especially conservative, trying to err on the high end for the 1980 values. Inflation adjusted, we're at $227,000 versus $442,000 in 2022. And again, median rent, same sort of a trend, almost doubling over this time. There's another key factor that's not even included in this data that is driving a lot of this change as well. And that factor is the cost of childcare. So these are three of the big rocks within our financial jars that have simply expanded beyond, and even, I've written the cost of tuition fees, room and board here. That doesn't even include the intermediary layer of student loans and what are people paying on those student loans. So these big factors have really changed the landscape of our personal finances. That's why I say that, I think at the end of the day, we are in a different world and the margin for error is thinner than it previously was. I find this perspective to be valuable from an organizational lens because we are able to get a glimpse into what people are feeling, especially the people that we work with, if we are perhaps not necessarily feeling that ourselves, but maybe we're in a position of, leadership or something like that. Maybe our salary is a little bit different. Maybe we bought our house in 1980, whatever the case is, right? So I think this perspective can be helpful when it comes to thinking about some of the folks that we work with in our society as a whole. I'm going to go into a little bit more on perspective, but to do so, I wanted to tell a little bit of a background and my story here. I think everybody here might already be connected with me on LinkedIn, but if you're not, I encourage you to connect with me. I have been working to do more LinkedIn posts adding some thoughts and perspective on general personal finance topics. Uh, LinkedIn has been a challenge. It's the first thing to go when I get very busy, but hopefully you'll find some of that content valuable. The perspective that I wanted to share that comes from my background is I want to tell you how I came to the work that I do now. So at On Tap, I run a foundational financial education and coaching program. I do a number of presentations, a lot of presentations within our community, serving our community when it comes to financial education, but also that happens with local companies as well. So I will go in and do presentations for large groups of employees, again, helping to move people past any financial stress or even anxiety to get to a place where we can create systems that work with our own unique money psychology rather than against it. But the reason I wanted to tell you how I came to this work is because I was a high school math teacher for 9 years. And I started a financial literacy curriculum for my second semester seniors because you know how it goes. They get senioritis and they go, when am I ever going to use this? And I was like, don't get me wrong, I'm a nerd and I love solving a conic section problem, but like, you're not going to use those. And so I created this financial literacy curriculum, and over the years of running it, started to realize, like, my goodness, adults really need this stuff also. I had other teachers that were coming in and asking to do after school sessions. And so that's how it kind of took off and how I got to the place where I am now. The reason that I found this valuable is because I learned two big things from teaching. The first one is maybe a little bit more general, and it's about teaching as a whole. And that is that I think sometimes our educational system, it almost like conceives of students as these buckets to be filled with knowledge. And that's ultimately not at all how I came to view the process of education. Instead, for me, I think education is really, it's about perspective expansion. Like, we all come to the world with our own unique experiences, and we can really learn a lot from taking our experiences, having a new experience, and allowing it to build on top. And of course, we can take in experiences from other folks and use that to further ourselves in whatever our pursuits are at the time. But the reason that I say education is about perspective expansion is because really, for me, like, my goodness, if we can learn to see a situation, to see a problem through ulterior angles, through different lenses. If I can step into somebody else's shoes and see how they're approaching that problem from this way instead of the way that I would have naturally approached it from this way, then ultimately that is the skill that will give me the most adaptability, the ability to, like, really solve challenging problems by simply viewing them from these other angles. So for me, that was really where I landed. And that idea of perspective expansion, I think, becomes super important when we go into some of these financial conversations. Again, because we all come to money from a different perspective, and we don't necessarily get taught a common vernacular in school when it comes to our personal finances. The second thing that I learned from this, this experiment in teaching beyond the idea of perspective expansion is, it's aligned with it, but it comes from the fact that I was a math teacher. So of course, like, when I first started in teaching personal finance, I just wanted to show you this beautiful compounding interest chart. Doesn't that make you want to take ownership of your finances? And it turns out that no, of course not, because we're humans, right? It starts here and it starts here. Um, I'll talk a little bit more about that in a bit. Let me just make sure that I have my slide. No. I will talk a little bit more about that in a bit. First, I wanted to go on to tell you a little bit more about this idea of perspective by sharing a story from this woman named Gigi Gonzalez. She actually ended up writing this book, Culture and Cash. But basically, Gigi tells her story in a really interesting way. Her story is she basically taught herself personal finance. And she did that by reading a vast number of books out there in the personal finance space. And so, you know what happens when you start to read some personal finance books, you all probably know this, right? Some of them will have different tactics, they'll recommend a different way to approach things. Some of the famous ones out there, for example, Dave Ramsey's approach is something that has a specific set of tactics that some other books they completely disagree with, right? And so she tells the story. She had to read a number of different books and really start applying them into her life to figure out, like, all right, what's going to actually work for me? The number of books ended up being somewhere, it was like above 50 books, right? And she starts collecting these ideas. She's figuring out really how it can work for her. And she got to a place where she's feeling pretty good about the systems that she's created. And so she brings them back to her family. And she comes from a Latin family. And as she told it to me, she's like, yeah, the thing about that is my family ended up just kind of going like, no, 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 no. Like, this is not how we talk about money. It's not how we deal with money. It's not how we think about money. And so she was telling kind of her reflections on this process. And she's like, what I realized is that almost all of these books that I had been reading, like so many of them are told from the same perspective. And that perspective tended to be the perspective of a money motivated white male. And money motivated white males, like they tend to see money from a very individualistic light. Whereas her Latin family sees money from a very communal perspective, right? Like they're like, we are in this together. Like we help each other when people, need support. We provide it. We're in it together. And so ultimately, even though she had done all of this work to learn and integrate a lot of principles on her own, she ultimately still had to go back to the drawing board to figure out systems that would actually work for her. And when you think about it, like the amount of time needed to read those books, to actually integrate these systems, it's a lot, right? Many people get stuck there where they can't even get to the point of reading that many books. But imagine somebody who had read that many books and gotten that many, tactical measures that they could try. And then they're like, now I gotta like figure out how to actually integrate it into my family or my community. So that is a story that comes from a maybe a cultural perspective. But the thing is that all of us, we have to do this for ourselves also with our own unique money psychology. And basically, the point there is that this creates a barrier to entry when it comes to learning how to manage our personal finances. If we don't include many perspectives in the conversation, then we are, by definition, leaving a number of folks out in the cold to basically like, if I can't put in the effort to try to figure, and like, how am I going to put in the effort if I'm working all the time just trying to bring in enough money to get by, right? So ultimately, this I think is where the idea of inclusion in the personal finance space takes, I think, a really positive turn, which is to say that in 2024 we have finally gotten to a space where we have a number of diverse perspectives that are speaking about money and sharing their experiences from their own stories in a way that can connect with more people. So I wanted to provide basically a case study. Specifically in this case, you'll see, many cultures represented, but also I wanted to provide specifically a case study of some of the women that are doing incredible work in the personal finance space through this particular webinar conversation. Before I go into the number of different perspectives out there, I did want to take a pause just to dig in a little bit further on this idea of our own unique money psychology, just to give a few examples of the wide range of kind of invisible scripts that we could have in our heads, right? Because as I said before, we all come to money from a different perspective. And it's not just, did I grow up without money? Or did I grow up with an overabundance of money? Because of course I'm going to see money differently if I grew up without it or an overabundance of it. But the thing is, we live in society, right? So society layers all of these extra things that we feel like we should be feeling on top of just the actual circumstances of our experience growing up, right? So I could have been anywhere along the spectrum of income, and I could still see money as being the root of all evil, right? Like the thing that makes corporations do unethical things. Or I could have grown up in an entrepreneurial family, right? And I could have then seen money as being the value exchange that I get when I do good in the world. Those are very different perspectives on the same thing, right? And that thing ultimately is just a tool that can help us to live the lives that we want to live. So if I believe one of those extremes or any of the thousands of perspectives that are in between or outside of those extremes, then do you think I'm going to treat money differently? That even if I don't even recognize that I'm doing it, that I might be acting differently with my money? And this is where I bring in the quote from the great psychologist Carl Jung: until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you'll call it fate. Of course, we're going to act with our money differently. And again, as I mentioned, like it's not just those two extremes, there's a number of different perspectives in between. I've talked to couples before, and one couple specifically that I was doing some coaching with, sometimes I will ask the question, like, what are the first couple of words that come to mind when you think about money? And it's always interesting to hear the responses. But one couple in particular that I was working with, the one member of the couple said the first couple of words that come to mind are something to the effect of like stress and he's got to always be like maintaining and controlling it. And there were just some very kind of negative connotations when the idea of money came up. And then the other member of this partnership, their three words were fun, freedom, and future. Again, like if that's the perspective that I'm coming from, then of course it's going to be a totally different conversation. Like if we think about it in these fundamentally different ways. And so all that to say that really giving us a menu of options out there for not only what financial systems could look like, but also even examples of what financial conversations can look like, because money is a taboo topic for many of us, and giving some frameworks for how to go about having these conversations can completely change the game when it comes to the actual day-to-day dynamics of managing our personal finances. And again, helping to create systems that can move us past any stress or anxiety so that we can live both for the now and for the future, which I think is what a lot of people are ultimately looking for. Okay, I wanted to dive into this case study on some women who are doing just fantastic things in the personal finance space. Hopefully, this will be a chance for people to go and check out some of what these folks are doing. I'm actually going to include one coming up who is a personal friend of mine who I am excited to bring into. I just did a podcast with her recently, and I'm excited to bring her into some conversations. But I wanted to start here, first of all. When we are talking about the personal finance landscape for women specifically, I think we have to bring up the fact that as absolutely mind-blowing as it seems, women were not technically able to open their own bank accounts until 1974 with the passage of the Equal Opportunity Act. Now, that's not to say that certain places and banks didn't allow it to happen. It's just that there was not a legal protection there until as recently as 1974. That's only 50 years ago, which is simply mind-boggling. And so as we are talking about perspective and inclusion, like, my goodness, what impact does that have when, something like the Equal Opportunity Act is as recent as that time frame. I think it has to be considered when we begin to have some of these conversations. Now, with that said, I wanted to again highlight some of the folks who are doing incredible stuff in this space, and to potentially offer some just brief insights to some of their viewpoints and what they are doing within the space, and then encourage folks to check it out. Now, as I begin saying this, this is something that I really enjoy doing as part of my job. Is, at the end of the day, I'm able to do these presentations, and I do a lot of one-on-one coaching. I have these conversations with people, but also, like, I'm just one person. And so I don't want you to ever, take my word as the truth. There are a lot of different perspectives out there. There are a lot of different tactics out there. And so at the end of the day, like, my goal is really to do two things. First of all, it's to be able to also curate resources that people can go and check out on their own. And hopefully some of them resonate with their own unique money psychology, and they can dive in and dig a little bit deeper. And then the second thing that I'm always trying to do is I always am seeking to empower rather than to prescribe, right? Like, I want to give somebody a hammer, give them a tape measure, give them a tool belt, and then you get to decide where you're going to drive the nail and what you're going to build with it. And so I think this is where including some of these resources and perspectives can be really valuable. And I want to start with Paco de Leon, who wrote Finance for the People. I didn't grab my book, but it's over on my bookshelf that I keep. Paco de Leon wrote the book called Finance for the People, which is a fantastic perspective. It is one of my favorites in this world. And I will go a little bit more into depth with specifically some of what she talks about within her book. But the big thing that I wanted to show within here is this pyramid of financial awesomeness. Basically, what she is able to do is, first of all, she's able to create some really cool and unique perspectives, including things like, how do you go about figuring out what job do I want to do if I'm including the financial part of that puzzle in my decision-making process, which I think a lot of us don't do, right? We send kids off to, like, hey, you got to go to college at age 18 and choose what you're going to be doing for the rest of your life. And we never give them this, like, general financial principle of try to not take out more in student loans than your anticipated first year's salary. Like, some people get it, but a lot of people don't ever hear that. So that perspective is always nice. And then the second thing that I wanted to highlight is this pyramid of financial awesomeness. Basically, the way that Paco de Leon goes about it is to say, hey, start at the bottom of this pyramid, move to the right. Once you've completed the bottom row, move up a rung, and then move to the right from there. And the book basically follows that perspective, which ends up being a really cool place to begin from. So, highly recommended resource there. One last thing that I'll say about Paco de Leon's work is that, the way that she frames it is that getting a grip on our finances is ultimately about navigating an unequal system, stepping into your own power, and addressing your own beliefs within that. And so I think that I've gotten a ton of perspective from her work, and I highly recommend checking out some of what she's done. Happy to chat more in the questions section if people want to know more just about, like, stories and details from each of these. Another person I wanted to highlight is my friend, my local resource, and actually financial coach as well, Jordan Pendleton. So Jordan has been running a podcast. She just reiterated it into a new version called You, Me, and Money. And specifically, she focuses on ways that couples, that partnerships can figure out how to get on the same page about money, because we never really get these models of what conversations between couples, between partnerships could look like. So I think she's doing a fantastic job in that regard. I highly recommend checking her out. The way that I've structured this, by the way, I didn't say it earlier, is that I have links at the bottom of some of these slides that you'll see, that I wanted to send these slides out afterwards so that people could go and check out each of these links and get a little bit more insights into what each of these folks are up to and what they're doing. So Jordan's link is to her podcast. And actually, I specifically put it to the podcast that her and I did just recently because I thought it was a fun one, but she's got a ton of great content on there. So highly encouraged checking her out. The next one that I wanted to highlight is Lynn Twist, who wrote The Soul of Money. This one is fantastic, and it's a deep dive into, some of these perspectives of money in a way that I don't think we typically think about it. I mentioned earlier that, in some regards, money is just a tool. But if you think about it, like none of our tools are just tools, right? Like there's the famous adage, if I have a hammer, everything starts to look like a nail. Well, we start to think through the structure of the tools that we use. And this is true even for things like Excel spreadsheets. When I learn how to use Excel, I literally start to restructure data in my mind to fit into the format that would be most effective for that Excel spreadsheet. I know that I want to, ultimately put this into a graph with this on my x-axis and this on my y-axis. And so therefore, if I wrote my data, if I wrote my, spreadsheet in that way, then I would have to, concatenate the data to be able to use, like, our tools really transform the ways in which we ultimately think. And so I think this is a fantastic resource, another one that I'd highly recommend. Yaneli is one of my favorites. She is a friend of mine also, although she is like, she's not local. She has made it big time. We went to the same college, and so it's really fun to get to catch up with her. She now is the director at an organization called NGPF, Next Gen Personal Finance, which is a nonprofit organization that seeks to empower high school teachers and teachers at all grade levels to include personal finance as part of their curriculum. And so they offer free resources for teachers in a way that basically they put everything into Google Drives so that teachers can create a copy of the document for themselves and then go in and customize things. Now, of course, it's a resource that's made for teachers, but I actually find it to be really useful for everyday, normal people as well to dig in there and find some things. But Yaneli wrote a book called Mind Your Money. And in the link to Yaneli's work, this is a link to her YouTube videos, which she created many years ago. She runs this channel called Miss Be Helpful, where she answers some foundational questions in the world of personal finance. Yaneli comes from a family that grew up in New York in the Bronx, and her perspectives are really interesting to, again, bring in this idea of kind of family dynamics into the topic of personal finance. Money with Katie. This is one that is, I highly recommend linking to this podcast. She does some really cool stuff. And in this particular episode, for folks who are interested in exploring some of the dynamics within broader women in personal finance space, and honestly, broader culture as well, some of her insights here were very powerful. The one that I wanted to bring up was she has this one, and I think this is the one I linked to, but she has this one particular podcast episode where she's basically looking at the three women of 2023 that had an economic impact that was, she compared it to the economic impact of the NFL, basically, and was like, these three women brought in an economic impact that can be compared to the economic productivity of the NFL. And yet, culturally, we have this perception that, like, and you can see this quote down here, that one form of entertainment is better than the other, which is, I think for me, the reason why it's important to have these conversations is because, again, this brings light into some of the perspectives that people we work with, that people in our communities have when it comes to money, and how we, sometimes write cultural scripts that may or may not be true, but beginning to analyze some of them can be worth our time and valuable. I also wanted to highlight Farnoosh Torabi. She runs a podcast called So Money. I'm linking to this one as well. She does a fantastic job of interviewing influential folks, and highly recommend it. This is the Get Good with Money book is one that you might have heard of already. But this is one that I think provides a perspective that maybe cuts a little bit more to the point on the tactical side of things, but also is really talking about how do we not just figure out the tactics of finances, but actually become more whole as people through figuring out our personal finance systems. At the end of the day, our personal finances are one of the things that no matter what, for everyone, some measure of understanding and competency in is worthwhile and valuable, because we cannot go through our lives just without ever touching any aspect of our finances. They are an integral part of our lives, and figuring out really how to integrate them into the whole people that we are becomes a really important part of the conversation. Allison Baggerly does some cool stuff over at Inspired Budget. I linked to a podcast on her for her as well. It's actually not the one shown in this particular picture that I snagged. I thought it was a little bit better one. So check that one out as well. Highly enjoyed it and recommended it. Wanted to take a moment to talk a little bit more about why we're here from the perspective of like how we as a credit union are hoping to be able to do this more and more, to facilitate conversations around this topic of financial education that support our community further. And so the thing that I wanted to say here is a little bit more of a background into how we go about doing this. And that is to say that, my goodness, when I first left teaching, I was trying to figure out, like, how do we do this good work out there in our communities on a foundational level and for free? Like, I didn't want to charge people for doing something that we should honestly have in every high school in America, but that we need in the adult world. And, you know, I think our society never really figured out how to profitize foundational financial education. And I think that, again, because the margin for error is smaller than it has ever been before, I think we're going to see more and more of it moving forward. The thing I wanted to say here is just that I'm proud to share that I think one of the pathways to do that is through the not-for-profit structure of credit unions. One of our major phrases within the credit union world is people helping people. And I'm just so pleased that I've been able to join On Tap, who recognizes that, hey, if we are able to provide value in our community and true foundational and free financial education, then, you know, like the credit union, we will grow and be able to serve more people as a result. We're a not-for-profit structure, and that means that any profits that we make, we try to give back to our members and community. Therefore, if we're able to grow in that regard, we'll be able to serve an even larger community. And so that structure has just been a beautiful place for us to land. And, you know, the idea here is that, of course, we serve our community. We give our profits back to members through high yields on deposits and through low rates on loans. Like, we have great products in that regard, but the reason that we're not really talking about those products, and like, I'm not here doing a sales pitch, and I'm not a commissioned employee. I don't make more money if we bring in more members or anything like that. The reason for that is because when it comes to foundational financial education, like, nobody ever built a wealthy life by saving 0.5% on an auto loan. Right? Like, that's something that's really nice. And it's something that we offer to all of our preferred employee groups that we partner up with, and we do financial education for their employees. Like, we do offer a 0.5% reduction on a standard auto loan. We offer all sorts of other perks and discounts, but that's not how people actually go about building systems that work for them and their own unique money psychology. That is through having ongoing, positive, productive conversations and really getting models for how do we have those conversations. And so we're super pleased to be able to do that in the community. I just feel really lucky personally that I get to be a part of that. Here's a picture. We did a presentation with the local professional Frisbee team, the Colorado Summit. We had about half of them, well, not a little more than half actually online, and then some of them showed up in person. So had a fun time with this and just thought it was a cool picture that I would throw in there and share. And I'll also just let you know that we run it's a 6-session. It doesn't have to be 6 weeks in a row. Free foundational financial education and coaching program. You know, it's one of those things where sometimes people are a little reluctant to hop on a call with me one-on-one to do some of these coaching programs. But I think once they get to know, I think really me, but also to know that they don't have to even bring up numbers themselves. We can literally just talk in generalities, and people can take a lot of information in that can be applied towards their own personal finances. It's been really cool to be getting this out in the community and seeing the impact that it has on individuals. And so I wanted to tell you about it just so that you know, because obviously we are going to be continuing to do that, but also like it's helpful for you to know because then we can continue to grow the program and impact more people, which I feel really grateful about. Last couple of things that I'll show, and then we'll call it good and see if there's any questions or conversations to be had. This is one of the tools that we use. This is the Conscious Cash Flow System, one of the many menu of options out there that can help people. Really, the goal for this for me is that it's not meant to be something where you spend all your time tracking every single expense. It's really a way to see the playing field, to see like what happens if I was to do this within my personal finances or this. Oh, well, it's a spreadsheet, so I can just erase it. I don't have to do it, but I get a view of the playing field as to what is the actual impact of that action, and is it worth it, or am I spending my time on the small decisions, whereas the bigger picture items can really make a lot bigger difference. And then, of course, we show lots of different ways that you can set up your systems in a way that's automated and that you can minimize the amount of time needed to manage it while also knowing that you're doing everything right, both for the now and for the future. That's all I have for you. I'm going to let you know, again, connect with me on LinkedIn if you're not connected, but also this QR code on the right goes to a free guide that we have. Check that out if it is interesting. It's just the top 5 things that folks can do to start to better their relationship with money. Right now I have it called Money Hacks because that sounds cool. And then if you would like to book an appointment with me, that is on the left. And I will open it up, see if anybody has questions so far and wants to continue the discussion, or if you just have any feedback or thoughts. All right, I'm looking at some responses. No questions. Thanks. All right, you all. Well, we'll call it good there. And thanks so much for jumping on. Reach out if anything does come up or if you want me to send over any resources. And I think the recording will get sent out to you all afterwards. And other than that, enjoy the rest of your Friday and have a great weekend. Oh, there's one Q&A here. I'm going to look at it. Thanks very much. Most informative. Awesome. Love that. All right. See you all next time.